The Middle East can often bring out the worst tendencies of observers, even historians, to seek the moral clarity of the simple. In a world of infinite moral complexity, there's comfort and confidence to be drawn from the black and white, the simple answers, even when it doesn't reflect the whole story. Fawaz Gerges is a political scientist who feels, as he tells me in this interview, that the Middle East has become the graveyard of intellectual nuance. His whole career has been a rejoinder to what he sees as a lack of proper intellectual rigor in the scholarship of the region. Fawaz was born in Lebanon, but spent much of his career at some of the United States and the UK's most prestigious universities. Now at the London School of Economics, he was the inaugural director of the university's Middle East Centre from 2010 to 2013. His latest book, The Great Betrayal, The Struggle for Freedom and Democracy in the Middle East, is an effort to counter the lack of nuance in the debate around why regional conflicts persist, and why political progress often seems paralysed. He offers, to try to understand this, a three-part formula that he thinks observers, historians, journalists of the region should apply in order to gain sufficient understanding. One of those is the agency of people on the ground, which is one of the first things to be discarded when commentators and historians reach for the simple answer. I asked Fawaz onto the podcast to discuss that book, but having him with us was an opportunity to discuss some of the other complex, often contested topics he's tackled throughout his career, topics that, though historical, still affect the Middle East today. So we discussed the rivalry between Egypt's President Gamal Abdel Nasser and the Islamist writer Sayyid Qutb. We also discussed some of the other leading regional personalities of the 20th century, such as the Saudi King Faisal and the Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, as described in some of Fawaz's other major works, like Making the Arab World and What Really Went Wrong. I'm Faisal Al Yafai. Here is this week's episode of The Lead. Fawaz Gerges, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I was wondering how to start this interview because I wanted to be sure we covered your latest book, The Great Betrayal, but I also wanted to explore a few ideas from your other books, What Really Went Wrong, The Making of the Arab World, which looks at Nasser. And you've spent your whole career in these books considering the region and thinking about it. And you write in the latest book, The Great Betrayal, the more time I spend in the region, the more skeptical I am of those who offer tidy answers to the region's chronic instability. To start, is it your sense that the kaleidoscope has been so shaken in the last 70 years in the Middle East that it isn't easy to apply these more general political categories to the Middle East? In other words, is it a genre all of its own now?
One of the lessons I have learned over the last 3 decades, studying and researching and teaching the Middle East, is that the Middle East is a graveyard for political science theories and international relations theories. These abstract general theories that are constructed by political science theorists who really do not know much about the region. I am a student of the Middle East who believes that you need to understand the Middle East from the bottom up as opposed to top down. You need to understand the Middle East really from the inside out as opposed to the outside in. And that's why I take what happens in the region very seriously, focusing on social movements, focusing on the agency of everyday people, trying to really understand the pulse of public opinion in the region.
But why do you think it is a graveyard for these political theories? I mean, political theories do explain quite a lot of the world. They don't explain every single part of it or every moment in history, but you can use them as tools. So why do you think the Middle East defies that categorization?
I use a great deal of historical sociology. Because it allows you to really look at the region from the inside out and the outside in. By focusing on historical events, long-term historical events, and theorizing about the lessons one can really take from 100-year history of the Middle East. And that's exactly what I do in my current book, The Great Betrayal. I really survey more than a century of consequential developments in the region, from the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1918 up to the downfall of Assad in 2024 and Israel's current war in Gaza, using historical sociology as a dynamic, fluid approach to really understand the regions. What I'm trying to say is that neat and rigorous explanations tend to really ignore and overlook the pulse and the pulses that take place in the region. I am against any kind of fixed categorization that imposes a particular framework made here, in laboratories.
But you set out in the book to answer this question that it was posed to you by one of your students, which is, why has the Middle East reached this seemingly low point after a century of state and nation building? And I think the starting point of the end of the Ottomans is very telling. So I suppose before we get into this three-part framework that you use to understand the region in the book, can you tell me why you think starting in 1918 was so important?
I think you really cannot understand the modern Middle East without understanding what happened in 1918. The Ottoman Empire was one of the greatest multi-ethnic, multi-religious, multinational empire that basically ruled not only the Middle East, many parts of the world for more than 500 years. It basically transformed rituals, ideas, politics, governance, society in multiple ways. And I think 1918 was represented a historical turning point in the sense the Middle East basically, because before 1918, the idea of empire, the idea of ethnicity, the idea of religion, the idea of communities were the dominant ideas in the Middle East. What happened in 1918, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, what colonial Britain and France did, not only they divided the spoils of the Ottoman Empire between themselves, but basically they invented the modern Middle East. So the reason why I start with 1918, because 1918 represented the invention of the modern state system. And I'm not talking about borders. I'm not talking about just borders and frontiers. Many of the new states where basically the borders of the state were drawn up by Britain and France. I'm talking about the nation state itself. Before 1918, the dominant organizational framework was the question of empire and religion and ethnicity. After 1918, the nation state was shoved down the throats of the people in the region by colonial Britain and France. Not just the nation state, the political economy, the security forces, and even the ruling elites were put on their thrones by colonial Britain and France to do their own bidding, to really serve the imperial interest. And that's why 1918 was a historical turning point. In fact, it was a transformative turning point because it transformed the entirety of what we called the modern Middle East.
I'm very happy to hear you say that. And that was one of the things that I liked about the book, actually, because we've explored that topic quite a lot on this podcast. We did a whole series on the end of the Ottomans, along with your colleague Eugene Rogan. And I think sometimes when we talk about the end of the Ottoman Empire, and I agree with you that there's this long tale of history which begins with the end of the Ottomans and we're still living through it. But sometimes when you start explaining it from that period in history, which is more than 100 years ago, you kind of see people's eyes glaze over. And I wonder if you think that is because perhaps we don't understand history very well, or because it's difficult to conceive that some things could be so big that they could still be affecting us 100 and something years later.
I mean, I think we overlook Ottoman legacy at the risk of our intellectual ability to understand what has happened in the Middle East in the past 100 years. The Ottoman legacy continues to be alive in the region in terms of political sensibilities, in terms of how societies used to be organized, in terms of the question of governance, in terms of really the relationship between the ruler and the citizens, in terms of ideas about the political, in terms of the way the Islamic city was constructed, in terms of architecture, in terms of education. And my module at the LSE start with 1918, but I caution my student that this is also a very simplistic way to study the modern Middle East. We really have to take the Ottoman legacy seriously, the impact of the Ottoman Empire, the continuing effects of the Ottoman Empire on the politics and societies of the region. Most of the cuisine in the region is Ottoman cuisine. People don't realize that.
I mean, now you're really getting into contentious territory.
Absolutely. I mean, people say Lebanese cuisine. What's Lebanese cuisine? Lebanese cuisine is an extension. It's commercialized Ottoman cuisine, Syrian cuisine. So the Ottoman legacy really not only was so critical, but continues to really have a major impact on people's sensibilities, and also affects the political, the politics, the way, the frameworks, how people really view politics, both in terms of bottom up and top down as well. For more than 500 years, the Ottoman Empire shaped life and society and politics in the region. And you cannot dismiss more than 500 years by saying, well, look, the Ottoman Empire collapsed in 1918. Of course it did, but the ideas and the concepts and the frameworks and the rituals. I mean, take, for example, the idea of minorities, the relationship between minorities and governments. That the Ottoman Empire, the whole millet system, the relationship between Istanbul or Ankara and minorities in the Middle East, it was basically coined by the Ottoman Empire, that minorities and ethnic communities and religious communities were left to their own devices to govern their own ideas as long as they paid their taxation and what have you. So this idea of this centralization and this idea of space and time when it comes to relationship between minorities and governments continues to resonate very deeply throughout the Middle East.
Well, let's get to the book. And in the book, you propose this three-part framework for understanding the region. I think we should take them one at a time. So the three are foreign intervention, domestic authoritarianism, and then the agency of everyday people. We'll start with foreign intervention. It's something, first of all, that you consider to be ongoing. And to quote the book, you write that the end of imperial politics has been predicted many times, but in spite of the tumultuous events that have rocked the region over the past century, it has not yet happened.
There is a great deal of misunderstanding about colonialism, and I really say it with humility, that somehow colonialism ended in 1945 at the end of World War II. Even though formal colonialism ended in 1945, colonialism left behind ideas, influences, rituals, political elites, left behind the soft influences of colonialism, according to Timothy Mitchell. But I go beyond that, that colonialism, formal colonialism ended in 1945, but what you have had after 1945 is informal imperialism. The Cold War, the global Cold War, was really a continuation of colonialism by other means. That the United States inherited the colonial legacy of its European allies, not by creating a formal colonial empire, but by creating an informal form of imperialism. That is, formal colonialism means direct rule over people. Informal imperialism is an indirect form of control and domination. And the Cold War itself, again, to quote Timothy Mitchell in his really superb book, Carbon Democracy, the United States established multiple mechanisms in order to maintain its hegemonic control of the Middle East after 1945. So while formal colonialism ended in 1945, informal imperialism replaced formal colonialism as the dominant hegemonic system in the Middle East. And here I want to highlight the two major threads in my argument. And the two major threads, you cannot really separate foreign intervention from deepening political authoritarianism. My argument is that there is a powerful partnership between external powers and local autocrats. And you cannot understand why political change has been so difficult to achieve. You cannot understand why the Middle East is such a messy place without understanding this powerful partnership between mainly Western hegemons and domestic authoritarians in the region. So this powerful partnership goes to the very heart to really explain why political change and social progress have been so difficult to achieve, and why conflict and violence and basically have been almost a frequent feature of Middle Eastern politics.
This entangling of the external and the domestic authoritarianism is a really important component in understanding why the Middle East looks like it does today. You say in the book that unlike the first generation of post-independence Middle Eastern leaders like Mossadegh in Iran, Nasser in Egypt, and the Saudi King Faisal, who defended the dignity of their people and nations, today's Arab rulers fear their people and lean on external support for political survival. First, I should ask you why you think that there is such a fear of these publics.
The reason why there is so much fear of the public in the Middle East, including Iran and including Turkey, not just the Arab world, is the lack of legitimacy, the lack of hegemony. That most of the leaders in the region not only lack legitimacy, popular legitimacy, they lack hegemony. They're running on empty. They're running really basically, they're relying mostly on coercion as opposed to persuasion. Unlike the first generation of post-colonized leaders like Muhammad Mossadegh in Iran, or Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, or King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. So what you have now, the new generation of leaders rely on external support to maintain, to consolidate their power, to maintain their really control of their population. And the divide between the rulers and citizens have never been as big as it is today. And that's why I think what we need to understand is that this kind of powerful partnership help us really to understand because people say it's either or. It's not either or. Just to give you an idea what I mean by this powerful partnership that maintains the existing order. I mean, think of Bashar al-Assad of Syria. Think of the war that erupted in Syria after the Arab Spring uprising, during the Arab Spring uprising in 2011. From 2011 up to 2024, the reason why Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, was able to really crush the revolt, the Syrian revolt against his regime, because he depended a great deal on his external stakeholders, mainly Russia and Iran. And when this kind of, partnership, powerful partnership between Bashar al-Assad and his external stakeholders, when it disappeared, the result that Russia was preoccupied in the Ukraine and Iran was very much preoccupied in Gaza and in Lebanon, Bashar al-Assad collapsed like a ripened fruit in less than two weeks in December 2024. This might be an exaggeration of a very complex situation, but in every case in the region, this powerful partnership helps us to understand not only why unpopular and why authoritarian leaders continue to dominate their societies, but also the lack of political representation, the lack of effective government, why people in the Middle East have not really been able to have self-determination. And of course, the Palestinian situation is the most extreme, but it really applies to many examples, many case studies in the region.
I was perplexed by your example of Syria, actually. I thought maybe we should discuss it a bit. Because you wrote in the book about the point you've just made about the downfall of Assad shows that this external intervention sustains these domestic authoritarianisms. But the removal of Assad would not have come about without the foreign intervention of Turkey. How does that work with the understanding of the formula?
Again, look, the question is, why wasn't Turkey able to help the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham or its allies in Syria topple Assad before 2024. And the reason why Turkey was not able to do so, that because Assad had the support of both Russia and Iran, and Hezbollah in particular. What we need to understand about Assad is that the Syrian case is not unique, is not distinctive at all. In fact, I can give you other examples in the region where any kind of change in this powerful partnership between local authoritarians and external powers would have the same result. So, yes, Turkey played a role in the downfall of Assad in December 2024, but it was not decisive. It was not the decisive factor. The decisive factor was the waning relationship between Bashar al-Assad and his external stakeholders, particularly Russia and Iran, in the late 2024.
Let's get to the third part of your three-pronged approach, and this is about the role of ordinary people. So the quote from the book is that history's great protagonists, its drivers, are the ordinary people who too often get overlooked, and nowhere is that truer than in the Middle East. You were about to explain it earlier, but start by explaining why you think that is a part that historians completely overlook.
Most of us are trained to deal with power. The first question is, who holds power? Who exercises power? Who are the leaders and the rulers of states? Whether you're talking about Donald Trump, or whether you're talking about the Egyptian president Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, or whether you're talking about the Syrian former president Bashar al-Assad. So there's a bias towards studying politics top-down as opposed to bottom-up. And in the Middle East in particular, the study of the Middle East, I mean, the big question in the Middle East, or the dominant question in the Middle East has always been the resilience of authoritarianism, the resilience political authoritarianism. So political scientists start with the premise is that what explains the resilience and the endurance political authoritarianism? And if you do so, then you really start automatically focus on the emirs, the kings, the president, the dictators, and what have you. What I'm trying to suggest is that, in fact, far from really, the agency of the people has always been alive and well in the Middle East. It has been struggling to be heard in the past 100 years. Think about it. How many people know tens of thousands of Iraqis perish in the prisons of Saddam Hussein? Hundreds of thousands of Syrians perished in the prisons of Hafiz al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad. Think of the brutalities of Middle Eastern regimes, and yet think of what the Palestinians have been trying to do in the past 100 years, against great odds, resisting settler colonialism and domination by Israel. Think of the Kurds, the struggle of the Kurdish people. So I think in many ways, political scientists in the Middle East really don't take agency very seriously, till recently, of course. And I think if you look now, what we have seen in the past few decades, whether you're talking about the Iranian Revolution in 1979, the Iranian Revolution in 1979 toppled one of the most brutal dictators, not just in the Middle East, in the world, the Shah of Iran. Think of the Arab Spring uprisings, 2010, 2012, 2018, 2019. And think, of course, the revolution against Bashar al-Assad. So what I'm trying to do is to really bring a bit of balance to the discussion of the Middle East and argue that agency must be taken seriously. And ultimately, I believe, as a historian, knowing the long arc of history, that the future of the Middle East will not be determined by the emirs and kings and the autocrats, but by a growing population of Arab and Muslim young men and women who basically have been demanding to be treated as citizens and not as dictators. But I think the Syrian revolution really tells us a great deal about the potential of agency, of local agency, and why we should take agency seriously, because Syria, to come back to my point, is not a distinctive case. The same thing that happened in Syria could happen in other countries in the Middle East. We might wake up tomorrow and see great fires taking place in other parts of the Middle East as a result of this local agency that is really alive and well in many countries in the region.
I think the reason that I was a bit surprised by that argument as it pertains to the West is that when we're talking about power, well, let me start with a quote, and then it'll be easier for the audience to understand where I'm going with this. The quote is from the book: "Even after millions of courageous citizens have taken to the streets since 2010 to topple autocrats in the region, everyday people are still not taken seriously in the Western media commentary and coverage of the Middle East." But I suppose my question to you, since we are talking about power, is, well, why would they be? I mean, doesn't it follow from your understanding of the role of Western powers in the Middle East that the media in those countries functions as an arm of the state in manufacturing consent? So in that situation, why would the individuals matter to the Western media?
I think it should. I think you and I are part of the media. And I think we are discussing and debating the importance of local agency and the potential of local agency. In the West, I understand why the Western media seems to be concerned about mainly power and about economic and material interest, as opposed to really the aspirations and the hopes and the fears of people in the region. And in fact, what really shocked me, and this probably is not probably is not shocking to you, is that many top Middle Eastern scholars and poets and artists did not take Arab agency seriously during the Arab Spring Uprising 2010, 2012, or even 2018, 2019. Some of the top poets, and they looked at Arab agency, they looked at the uprising or the Arab Spring Uprising as part of a conspiracy by the West in order to trigger chaos and instability in the region. And this is by itself, it tells you a great deal. And the reason why we need to take local agency seriously, because again, to come back to the idea that hundreds of thousands of people have died, have perished in the struggle for freedom and self-determination. My book really is not about democracy. I mean, my book really is about freedom, about self-determination, is about really people reclaiming, because democracy really is the highest stage of, you might say, whether it's liberal democracy or social democracy. My key point really is about pluralism, about the rule of law, about citizenship, about the ability of people really to determine their own affairs and reclaim their state from presidents for life.
I'm very pleased that you brought up the question about historians understanding the Arab Spring. Actually, it led very nicely into this question that I have about the way that history is interpreted, or the way that political examples are interpreted by historians. I'll try to parse it. I agree broadly with historians like yourself who feel that the immediate post-war era was instrumental in setting up the structures, institutions, ideas that still dominate the Middle East today. But I also wonder if there is new history happening, and then sometimes historians can't see it. Now, the example I'm thinking of, and I think you were alluding to something along those lines a moment ago, is about a historian like Patrick Seal, who very much saw the Syrian revolution through the Cold War lens you were describing, and I think couldn't quite see it as something new, which I think the Arab Spring was at the time. Do you detect that repeated use of the Cold War lens by historians in trying to understand the modern Middle East?
Based on everything that I have learned, is that the global Cold War, the frameworks, the political economy of the global Cold War, the arms, the military bases, the instruments of control, the coercion, the economic sanctions, in fact, the economic carrots as well, which were part of the Cold War, what we call the framework Cold War, transformed the trajectory of Middle Eastern politics. And I'm choosing my words very carefully here. That the global Cold War, the system that was put in place between 1945 and the present, really transformed, changed, shaped the trajectory of Middle Eastern politics and economics and society, and continues till the present now. the whole idea of the global Cold War and what the United States and its allies did between 1945 and 1989, not only to roll back Soviet communism, but to open Middle Eastern societies for the global financial market, to really impose a kind of a liberal economic framework, and to basically prevent Middle Eastern state from establishing any kind of a sovereign economic sovereignty, let alone political sovereignty. Because, look, we're talking probably in circles here. The reason why, these powerful partnerships exist between external powers and local autocrats, because this particular partnership really was a byproduct of the global Cold War that was set up between 1945 and 1989. And anyone who diverged, anyone who challenged, anyone who resisted, basically was either penalized or basically toppled, starting with Muhammad Mossadegh in August 1953 and Gamal Abdel Nasser between 1956 and 1967. So the global Cold War, as it relates to the Middle East, is not just about it's a new history. And I think it's about time that not only we examine the colonial moment, the former colonial moment between 1918 and 1945, but we really pay serious attention to what the global Cold War has done to Middle Eastern politics and state and society.
I wanted to talk about that book, What Really Went Wrong, and so we've managed to bring that in. As part of that conversation about your previous books, I also want to ask you about the other book you wrote before What Really Went Wrong, which is called Making the Arab World, Nasser Qutb and the Clash That Shaped the Middle East, which is probably my favorite book that you've written. We were talking before that it's also a book that I think you get asked about a lot. One of the reasons that I think it's interesting for me is that you take seriously this broader struggle domestically within the Arab world between nationalists and Islamists. And it's a struggle that I think you will agree is still with us in some form.
Thank you for mentioning this book, because if we focus mainly on the relationship between external powers and local autocrat, we miss a major aspects of what happens in Middle Eastern politics, what happened in Middle Eastern societies. It's not just about Western powers. It's not about external powers who are intervening in internal Arab politics. We need to take Middle Eastern politics seriously. And this ideological, this historical clash between the two most powerful social movements, Arab nationalism and political Islam, or the two dominant ideologies, secular Arab nationalism and political Islam, also played a major role in shaping the social forces, the balance of social forces. And it has done a great deal of damage to Middle Eastern politics and Middle Eastern societies on multiple levels, in terms of deepening political authoritarianism, in terms of unleashing a clash that continues to unfold in the Middle East, in terms of really, because historically speaking, Arab nationalism and political Islam were an integral part of the anti-colonial movement between 1918 and 1945. The anti-colonial movement in the Middle East was really made up of these two dominant ideologies, of these two dominant social movements. It was only after the end of formal colonialism in 1945, it was only when the nationalists came to power in the early 1950s that the anti-colonial movement split into two major factions, Arab nationalism and political Islam. And they split and they clashed bitterly and bloodily from the late 1950s up to the present. And the splitting, the clash between the two movements was not about ideology. It's not about different visions from the Middle East. It was not really about, you might say, philosophical. It was mainly about politics, about power. Who should control the state? What kind of a Middle Eastern state? So sadly and tragically, even though the clash between secular Arab nationalism and political Islam was all about politics and power and authority, it has been portrayed as an ideological, philosophical clash, and it has done a great deal of damage to Middle Eastern societies because it has prevented any kind of, you might say, a kind of normal politics, of healthy politics. And it has been very costly because it has created multi-societal clashes, whether in Egypt or Saudi Arabia or Algeria and Jordan and Syria and other countries as well.
One of the reasons that I like the book so much is that I think you've understood something that a lot of historians in the West have failed to understand, which is the political imagination that was offered, for example, by Arab nationalism, by Nasserism. And I think they have failed often to situate Nasserism and nationalism in the context of the time, which, as you say, was a response itself to conditions of the time.
I don't know, I'm a bit criticized by critics when they review my book, Making the Arab World, or What Really Went Wrong. They think that somehow I overlook the authoritarianism of Gamal Abdel Nasser or the authoritarianism of the first generation post-colonized state. I don't. Nasser was not a Democrat. Muhammad Mossadegh was a Democrat. Faisal was not a Democrat, King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. But I think the reason why I take him very seriously, because they had a vision for their societies. Their vision was economic sovereignty. Their vision was political sovereignty. Their vision was to really create an organically healthy state. Their vision was to really repair the damage of decades of colonialism. And this particular vision, sadly and tragically, was undermined by their own deepening authoritarianism and also by the global Cold War, because the United States, as an informal empire, would never tolerate any economic sovereignty or political sovereignty on the part of states in the Middle East, because not just the Middle East, because I think the Middle East was very important not only because of oil and energy, but in terms of its strategic position between Europe and the world, because of its assets, because of the Arab-Israeli conflict, because of historical resonance, for a variety of reasons. So the reason why I take the vision of Arab nationalists and nationalists very seriously, because they really aspired to overcome the scars and the traumas of colonialism and build societies that basically provide goods and services and hope for millions of their population.
If you take nationalism or Nasserism as an attempt to have political sovereignty, what do you think, and you say, for example, that nationalism and Islamism are still with us, what in your view remains vital or recoverable in the Nasserist project, and which parts of it have now passed into history?
I don't think anything remains of the Nasserist project. I think the Nasserist project is per se, is obsolete, it's done. I think the most important defect of Nasserism was its autocracy and authoritarianism. Nasser believed that democracy was a luxury that Egyptians could not really afford. And I think it was its downfall. It was structurally flawed because it could not really imagine, it did not really have the imagination to conceive of a new society, an open society, a free society. It was terrified of its own shadows. I flesh out how the United States basically delivered Nasser by a million cuts. The pressure was overwhelming. But despite everything that Nasser could not really imagine, a society, a free society. And the reason why I think I got to know Nasser a bit over, decades of studying, Nasser came from a very petty bourgeoisie background. He did not really have the vision, the education, the imagination that Muhammad Mossadegh had in Iran. Muhammad Mossadegh had a PhD from one of the top universities in Switzerland and Paris. Gamal Abdel Nasser had really secondary education, came from a lower class family, was a military man, a colonel in the army, And also, Gamal Abdel Nasser was extremely pressurized by the United States in order to do its bidding. But one thing Gamal Abdel Nasser had that Muhammad Mossadegh did, and most of the first generation of post-colonized state did, was the aspiration, the hope to have economic sovereignty, not just political sovereignty. They realized, Muhammad Mossadegh and Gamal Abdel Nasser and other post-colonial leaders, they realized that economic sovereignty was integral to political sovereignty. And this is really where they put their finger on the pulse of what really matters. And sadly and tragically, they basically fell on their sword because they faced great odds.
It's interesting that you brought up Mossadegh and Gamal Abdel Nasser in terms of social class. I always think that one of the topics that isn't much discussed about the Middle East, and it's a really important one, is the role of social class in formulating the way the Middle East has panned out.
One of the most important books ever written on the Middle East is by Batato, an Iraqi scholar who wrote his book on the Iraqi social classes and formations. The Batato book, the social classes on Iraq, is one of the most really texts ever written on the Middle East, because he looks at the Iraqi revolutions in 1958 and the rise of the Ba'ath Party by examining the social balance of power between the various social classes, the Marxists, the landowners, the petit bourgeoisie, the military officers. And the reason why this is a very important question, and I really don't do justice to it because I'm not a Marxist like Batato, but I respect his analysis tremendously because take Nasser, for example, take the officers, the junior officers who toppled the Egyptian monarchy, the pro-Western Egyptian monarchy in 1952, and established a republic, the Egyptian Republic. You cannot understand the politics, the agenda, the imagination, the personalities of the army officers who toppled the monarchy in Egypt in 1952 and ruled Egypt till the present. Abdel Fattah al-Sisi is a byproduct of the 1950s as a military man, without understanding the social formation of these Egyptian free officers. Most of them came from down and under. They were either lower classes or middle classes or part of the peasantry. So in a way, the reason why we talk about Gamal Abdel Nasser, because Gamal Abdel Nasser was a young officer in his 40s when he seized power in 1952. How can we understand Gamal Abdel Nasser's worldview, imagination, policies, mistakes, blunders, temperament without understanding his social class? And most of his comrades belong to a similar social class. And here I think Marxism is a magnificent analytical framework to help us really understand not only the role of the social classes, but how social formations and social backgrounds shed light on the politics of the Middle East. Whether you're talking about, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, or Hafiz al-Assad in Syria, or Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, or the various military men in Iraq, in Sudan, in Libya, and what have you. So the social classes, analyzing the social classes, is an important factor in really helping us to understand how politics in the Middle East function on multiple levels.
Let's go back to your book, because I realize we're coming to the end of the interview. You were talking to me before about an aspect of the book that you think is really important but is often overlooked, which is the long tail consequences of so much conflict across so many years.
You mentioned the three threads in my book, my framework. I think one of the most important thread is the effects of prolonged regional conflicts on state, society, and economy in the Middle East. Whether you're talking about the Arab-Israeli conflict, think of how many wars have taken place in the Middle East between 1947, 1948, and the present. Think of the effects of the Arab-Israeli conflict on state and society and economy in the Middle East, not just in terms of the human cost. I'm talking about the economic cost, the social cost, about the deepening authoritarianism. Think of the conflicts in the Gulf. Think of, Iraq's invasion of Iran in 1980, or Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1991, or the border dispute between Iraq and Iran in the 1960s.
All the money that's been spent on wars or on preparing for wars.
Trillions of dollars, trillions of dollars. And here is what's really significant about the impact of prolonged regional conflicts on state and societies. All the studies that we have seen, the effects of prolonged regional conflict on the Middle East, in the Middle East, tend to be costlier, more enduring, and more persistent than other regions in the world. In fact, the World Bank and the IMF and many economists are wondering, they wonder why the effects of prolonged conflicts in the Middle East tend to be costlier, tend to be more resilient and more enduring. I make the argument, the reason why they are more enduring and costlier because of the lack of institutions and because of the persistence of foreign intervention. You have really intense and persistent foreign interventions on the politics of the Middle East, whether you're talking about the Arab-Israeli conflict, or whether you're in the Gulf, or whether it's in Syria, or whether it's in Libya, and whether it's in Lebanon. To come back to the overall picture, you cannot really understand why the Middle East has reached this low point in its 100-year history without understanding not only the powerful partnership between external powers and local dictators, but also the effects prolonged conflicts on state and society and economy.
Let's end by talking about Gaza, which you just raised. Do you agree with the argument which has been put forward by Pankaj Mishra, the author Omar Al-Akkad, actually on this podcast, among others, that the Gaza war represents a moral schism, that it fundamentally reshapes the moral universe that comes after it? Or do you see it more as a continuation, expansion of previous wars?
What I show in my book is that really Gaza is not unique. Gaza is not distinctive. Gaza is not an outlier. That is, from 1945 till the present, not only it has forfeited its leadership, liberal leadership and vision for the world, but it partnered with settler colonialism and political authoritarianism in order to dominate, in order to maintain its hegemony in the region. I think Gaza, the tragedy of Gaza, the slaughter in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza it's a climax, really represent the climax of American military intervention in the region. And Israel could not do what it does without America's preponderant support. So whether you're talking about Iran in 1953, or whether American military intervention in the region, throughout the 1950s, or America's global war on terror, people don't realize that more than 1 million people died as a result of America's global war on terror, and now Gaza. And the reality is, again, to come back, this powerful partnership, not only between external powers, particularly Western powers, the United States, and local autocrats, but settler colonialism. And my book is called The Great Betrayal. I think of all the people in the Middle East, of all the people, the Palestinian people have been utterly betrayed. First, by colonial Britain, and secondly, by informal imperial America. And guess what now? The Palestinians have been betrayed by the Arab rulers, thrown the Palestinians under the bus. So for the past 100 years, the Palestinians have been betrayed by multiple powers. And now, sadly and tragically, that even in the Arab world, the Palestinians are really no longer, the Palestine question no longer really prioritized, particularly by the dominant rulers. And here is President Trump now, as you and I talk, visiting the Gulf state. Yet I doubted very much whether Palestine will be a priority question.
Fawaz Gerges, thank you very much.
I really appreciate it.
You've been listening to The Lead from New Lines magazine. Fawaz Gerges' book, The Great Betrayal, The Struggle for Freedom and Democracy in the Middle East, is out now and available online and in all good bookstores. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favourite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.